I'm a slash-a-holic, addicted to the fright. Narration so hypnotic, Josh keeps me up all night. Eyes and masks and pain, blood runs like the rain. Evil finds its way in spine-chilling fray. Out of breath but not out of light. Horror days, don't look behind. Feel the terror cry. Will you dare to slay? I'm a slash-a-holic, addicted to the fright. Narration so hypnotic, Josh keeps me up all night.
Hello there, Slash-a-Holics. This is Lisa Wilcox here from A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 and 5, Alice Johnson, and you are listening to the 80s Slasher Librarian. Ciao. Have fun.
A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child. Chapter 1. They were making love in Dan's bedroom, and Alice was reaching her peak, dragging her nails over Dan's back hard enough to leave thin red tracks. She cried out and arched her back as Dan's movements became more intense, and he breathed her name into her ear before he, too, cried out, and they clutched one another desperately, kissing as if it were their last moment together. When they were finished, after several long minutes of stroking and kissing one another lovingly, Alice whispered, "I'm gonna take a shower." Dan smiled at her sleepily and rolled aside so she could get out of bed and go into the bathroom. At first, when she and Dan had started dating last year, Alice had thought with resignation that it would only be temporary until someone prettier and more interesting came along and captured Dan's attention. But as their relationship went on, Alice found that she was becoming prettier and more interesting. She turned on the shower, waited for the water to get hot, then stepped into the billowing steam and began to soap up, lifting her face to the jets of hot water. Last year, after the deaths of her brother and friends, Alice had thought nothing good would ever happen to her again, but that had changed. Not only was she ecstatically happy with Dan, but her father had stopped drinking and started going to Alcoholics Anonymous. With graduation less than 12 hours away, Alice was happy. She scrubbed her hair, working up a lather as a gurgling sound cut through the hiss of the shower. Alice stopped, frowned, and listened. The sound was coming from below. She looked down to see the water in the tub swirling frantically over the drain, being sucked loudly through the tiny round holes. She stepped back from the drain, frowning. The drain was sucking the water into an unnaturally violent whirlpool. The pull was so strong that Alice could feel her feet slipping over the bottom of the tub toward the drain, slipping, until her legs flew out from under her and she landed on her ass, sliding down the tub toward the drain, fighting the tremendous pull, her arms flailing as she was sucked down into an oppressive blackness through which she plummeted helplessly until she landed in a naked heap on a cold floor. She huddled into a crouched position, hugging herself to hide her nakedness in the dim light as she listened to the sound of loud babbling voices. She turned slowly, fearfully, and looked down a long, narrow room with plain metal-framed beds lined against the walls on either side. There were mattresses on the floor, some of them ripped to shreds. There were men moving in the shadows, some on the beds, others walking or crawling on the cold, dirty floor. They wore what appeared to be pajamas. They had once been white. Now they were darkened by brown and yellow stains, and grimy lumps clung to the material. The men looked filthy, their hair scraggly and shiny with grease. Some of them masturbated in dark corners, grunting wetly as their eyes rolled in their heads. Others laughed as they picked at their clothes and scrubbed their faces again and again. Some of the men paced frantically, murmuring to themselves as if their lives were about to end. None of them noticed her. Not yet, anyway, she thought, with a sudden jolt of fear. A sound made her turn around to face a steep metal staircase that led to a thick lead door. Two men with name tags on their white institutional uniforms stood in the doorway, backlit by a glaring white light. "How many you think there are?" one asked. "I'd make it 100, the other said. Their voices echoed in the cavernous room. Alice took a breath to shout at them for help, but she realized suddenly that she was wearing clothes. She stood slowly and looked down at herself. She was wearing a nurse's uniform with a name tag over her left breast. It read, Amanda Krueger. Before she could react to the change, one of the orderlies shouted from above, "Merry Christmas, lunatics!" He slammed the lead door with a thunderous clang. Heavy bolts slammed into place. Alice screamed, "No! Wait!" She was startled by the sudden silence behind her, and turned to see the men facing her. Some of them smiled, others laughed, and a few just grunted, drooling as they reached out for her, staggering forward. Terrified, Alice stumbled backward and turned, but there were more of them. They came from every direction. She screamed as a voice rose from the group. "Me first! I'm first! Let me through!" A thin, hunched man pushed his way through the crowd, cackling as he grinned at her with wet lips. Alice dropped to her knees, fist clenched, screaming, because the man pressing toward her looked so familiar. His skin was smooth and he had hair. He had not been burned, but his eyes, his nose, his mouth, even his voice. She had seen him before. He looked like Freddy Krueger. The wiry man slobbered as he reached out, grabbed her hair, and Alice screamed, opening her eyes and looking down to see Dan. She lay on top of him, and he stared up at her, shocked. Alice gave a sigh, relieved that her nightmare was over, and reached out to stroke Dan's cheek. He smiled, but his smile became a sinister grin, and he moved quickly, violently, rolling Alice onto her back, and she cried out, startled, looking up as the slobbering man grinned down at her, clutching her shoulders as he worked his way between her legs, grunting. "You love it, Alice, don't you? Alice! Alice! No!" she screamed as Dan shook her, shouting,
"Alice! Alice!"
She stopped and gaped at him with wide eyes.
"It's okay, sweetheart.
He whispered.
It's only me."
As her heart pounded in her chest, she muttered, "Oh, guess I was having a nightmare." Dan kissed her forehead and whispered,
"It's okay now. It's okay."
Chapter 2.
And so, my fellow graduates,
Dan said with mock solemnity, standing on the edge of the fountain in front of Springwood High shortly after the graduation ceremonies.
let me remind you that the world is your oyster.
Mark sat on the grass, sweeping his pencil over a sketch pad, stopping to push his thick, horn-rimmed glasses up his nose as a few other graduates, including Alice, stood around, watching Dan with amused chuckles as parents and other students filed out of the gymnasium. Mark was drawing a comic book illustration of Dan, glancing up at him now and then as his hand moved quickly. He'd shed his cap and gown and wore a Judge Dredd t-shirt and blue jeans.
The sky's the limit.
Dan went on.
Nothing succeeds like success. And if you think the glass is half empty, then piss in it until it's full.
Dan bowed to the smattering of applause that rose up from his scattered audience. Then he threw his cap into the air hard, and it came down, onto Mark, who dropped his sketch pad to lean forward and catch it. As he sat up again, Mark saw that Greta had picked up his pad and was standing a few feet away, paging through it. His face flushed. There were several pictures of her in there. Greta was an eye-popper. She was fair-skinned with cascading blonde hair and a body that was fashion model thin. In fact, she planned to become a model, but that was part of her problem. She was ultra-thin and tried too hard to stay that way. It would be unfair to say Greta ate like a bird. When Mark was a little kid, he'd had a canary that ate more in 6 months than he'd seen Greta eat during their entire senior year. Even so, Greta was beautiful and Mark adored her. But he didn't want her to know that, so he lunged for the sketch pad. It was too late. Greta looked at him and smiled gently. "Can I have one of these?" she asked, holding up a picture of herself. Mark shriveled with embarrassment. "Come on, a graduation present to your inspiration, who, by the way, would have charged you $17.50 an hour if she'd known she was modeling for your drawings." She smiled, but Mark dropped Dan's graduation cap, snatched the book away from her, and swept it behind his back. Then, after a moment, he opened it, drew a straight line, tore out the page, and handed it to her, saying,
"That's a profile."
She looked at it and scowled. "Come on, Mark. If I'm going to stand a chance modeling in New York, I've got to be thin." Standing, Mark said with smiling concern,
"But at the rate you're going, Greta, you're going to waste away before you make the cover of Vogue and marry the rock star of your choice."
Greta stuck her nose in the air, feigning annoyance. Rock stars were so mid-80s. Yvonne and Alice approached them, and Yvonne said, "I believe the current trend is more toward international corporate bankers." Yvonne was tall, black, and very attractive, although in a more mature way than Greta. She was a student at the university, working as a nurse aide as she finished her nursing education. She held up a key on a large metal ring. "This," she said, "is the key to the university pool, which officially closes at 6 o'clock.
"Would that mean our party officially starts at 7?
Mark asked. "That's the opinion of those in the know," Alice said with a conspiratorial smile. She looked tired, but still pretty. Just a year ago, she'd been so plain, so unnoticeable. Mark supposed that losing as many loved ones as Alice had would tend to make one grow up fast. "Yo, Super Jock!" Yvonne shouted, waving the key at Dan. 7 o'clock! Dan smiled and headed for them as his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jordan, came out of the gymnasium and crossed the grass. "Careful climbing around on that fountain, Dan," Mr. Jordan said. "We can't have state star running back breaking his leg the day he graduates from high school." He slapped his son on the back. "You know, being on campus like this, I was thinking about my last game senior year." Mark saw Dan and Mrs. Jordan exchange a knowing, "Here we go again, look." "We were playing the Magnolia Rangers," Mr. Jordan went on. "Fourth quarter, 10 seconds left. The Rangers have the ball, and old Tom Peters lets fly with his bullet pass, and, well, sir, I intercept it." In unison, Dan and Mrs. Jordan chimed, "And run it back 80 yards for the winning touchdown." Mr. Jordan blinked and smiled good-naturedly. "Have I told you that one?"
3 times.
Dan said warmly.
This week. You're senile, Dad. Your memory's going. We're putting you in a home.
Mr. Jordan tapped the side of his head and said, "Budweiser's disease." Mark stepped away from the Jordans and turned to Yvonne and Alice, saying,
"About that party, you've got the pool key, but how are we going to get past Officer Bellin, a security guard?"
Yvonne grinned. "Be in the bushes behind the employee parking lot at 5 to 7, and bring your towel." Noticing that Alice was watching Dan, Yvonne said, "Why don't you go over and help Dan flex his muscles?" Mark noticed Greta walking back toward the gymnasium, looking at the paper he'd given her after drawing a straight line on it. He had second thoughts and started after her.
"Hey, Greta!"
he called. When she stopped and turned, he asked,
"Were you serious? Would you really like one of those pictures?"
She smiled. "Yes, I thought they were very good." He opened the sketch pad and tore one out, handing it to her, not without embarrassment. She looked at the drawing proudly, smiled, and whispered, "Thank you," and leaned forward to give him a quick kiss on the mouth. Mark's chest swelled, and he grinned as he watched her walk away, admiring the picture he had drawn. "Hello," Alice said to Dan's parents. Mrs. Jordan gave her that worried look that seemed to be typical of all mothers who realize they're losing their boy to another woman. "Congratulations," Mr. Jordan said warmly. "You look so nice today." "Thank you." Mrs. Jordan lifted her eyebrows and said, "We didn't get a chance to say hello to your father. He left so quickly." "Yeah, I guess he had some business." Alice didn't know why her father had left so quickly. She wished he had stuck around.
Won't it be nice never to walk those hallowed halls again?
Dan laughed, waving toward the school.
1 month from now, we'll be in Paris, and high school will be just a memory, a bad dream.
Alice smiled and tingled at the very thought of their coming trip to Europe. Dan, Mr. Jordan said, you've got a full athletic scholarship to State College. Pro Scouts are already sniffing around. You'd better come home from Europe ready to run.
Didn't I tell you?
Dan said jovially.
We've already decided to defect to Bulgaria. We're never coming home.
Mrs. Jordan turned to Alice and asked sternly, Alice, how does your father feel about this trip to Europe? As if sensing trouble, Mr. Jordan took her arm and led her away, winking at Dan and Alice as he said, Honey, did I ever tell you about the time we were playing the Magnolia Rangers? Dan turned to Alice, studied her face a moment, and said,
Something besides my mother is bothering you.
My dream, she whispered.
You never talked about it. It wasn't him, was it?
Not exactly, but this was the first time since last year, that I wasn't in control.
You want to tell me about it?
He asked, stroking her cheek. She smiled and nodded. On their way home, she shared her dream with Dan. As Dan parked his truck outside Alice's house, he said,
It could be just a dream. A regular dream.
If anyone knows what a regular dream and what's something more, I guess it's me, wouldn't you? He nodded, and they were quiet for a moment as she stared out the window. With determination, she shook her head, unwilling to let the dream get to her. Too many good things were happening. To hell with him, she snapped, turning to Dan. I was his only doorway, and I'm not letting him back in. She leaned over, kissed Dan, and said, I hear Switzerland has 275 kinds of chocolate. I plan to eat one of each.
What time do you want to go to the party?
Dan asked. I can't. I'm working.
But I thought you and Yvonne were in on this together. They'll plan to get past Mad Dog Bellin, dread Campus Guard.
Don't worry. We've got it covered.
Then you have to go to the...
She cut him off. Those Swiss chocolates cost money, you know. She kissed him again, then got out of the truck. When she was halfway to the door, Dan called her name. She turned to see him smiling bashfully at her. He looked away, then at her again.
Well, you know.
He said, I love you too, she called. In the house, Alice's father asked, Where you been? With Dan. On his way out of the living room, he said, Well, get in the kitchen and fix dinner. His words caused her pain. She started for the kitchen, murmuring sarcastically, Congratulations, darling. This must be the happiest day of your life, darling. You looked lovely, darling. I was so proud of my little... She stopped dead in her tracks as she entered the kitchen. The room was filled with flowers. Roses, carnations, daisies, lilies, and orchids filled the kitchen with their sweet fragrance. A smile grew slowly on Alice's face. She was unable to hold back the tears that stung her eyes. She spun around to see her father standing in the doorway. His face still held its gruff, emotionless expression, but he stepped forward and touched her face. You look so pretty up there today, he whispered. She threw herself at him, squeezing him tightly. I didn't see you afterwards. I left because I didn't want to, embarrass you. Your father, the drunk. The alcoholic, she snapped. There's a big difference, unless you stop going to your meetings. He smiled wearily. Clean and sober and boring. That's your old man. She smiled at him for a moment, then noticed the kitchen clock, 12 before 7. I've got to change for work, she said. Anne'll have a fit if I'm late. She turned to leave, then stopped, turned back, and smiled lovingly. I love my flowers, Daddy. He looked away, embarrassed. Chapter 3 45 minutes after Richard Belland got off his motorcycle and began his shift as security guard, the telephone at his station rang, and he unlocked the metal box in which it was housed. Telephone Station 7, he answered. Is this Officer Belland? A female voice asked. It is. This is Lieutenant Clemens with the State Police. Why the hell are you answering this phone? She snapped. I'm afraid I don't understand, the little overweight man said. I guess not. Why aren't you out on I-45? Isn't your relief man there yet? No, ma'am. You never received my 1013. An assist officer call? No, ma'am. The land had been outgrowing his uniform for some time, but it wasn't until that moment that he really noticed its snugness around his jutting belly. Do I have to do everything myself around here? The woman shouted. Let me go through it again. Alice dressed for work as she spoke into her speakerphone in a firm, angry voice. There's a near riot out on the interstate. Kids from your university. You're being asked to assist the state police because of your experience in dealing with students. Your relief man was supposed to be there at, 1800 hours? We can't afford to wait any longer. Now, I'm going to personally give you directions to the riot site. Ready? Thrilled by the prospect of helping the state police, Belan fumbled the pad and pencil out of his pockets and wrote down the directions in scribbling, saying, But that's 2.5 hours drive. I'll get right on it, fast as I can, ma'am. He hung up the phone and hurried to his motorcycle in the parking lot as Dan, Mark, Yvonne, and Greta watched him waddle across the parking lot, stifling their laughs. Hang on to that girl, Dan, Yvonne whispered. She knows how to make a hell of a phone call. Okay, guys, we've got until midnight. Gathering their things together, they headed toward the pool. Dusk began to fall as Alice walked to work. She was hurrying along the sidewalk, not wanting to be late, when she heard a sound, a sing-song sound, like chanting softly. She slowed her pace as she began to pass through Springwood Park to go into town, and looked through the fence to the children playing in the park. They were jumping rope, sitting in the mounds of sand between the swing set and the monkey bars. Very familiar children. Their skin was ghostly white, their eyes dark, and stomachs bloated, and they were chanting. As they counted on and on, Alice stopped and watched them, whispering to herself, This should not be happening. She hurried by them, trying desperately to ignore them and their ominous chanting, heading toward the open green in the middle of the park, when she noticed that the children had added a new couplet to the rhyme. 9, 10, he's coming back again. She spun toward them, but they were gone. Turning back again to head for work, she saw that, where there had been nothing a moment ago, there now stood an imposing Gothic-style building with stone walls and towers. She somehow knew, although she had no idea how she knew, that it was a Catholic hospital. A sort of convent, too, because nuns in sparkling white habits walked in and out of doorways and scurried across the green grass surrounding the sinister building. I'm awake, Alice thought. I'm not dreaming. Why is this happening? Unable to resist her curiosity, she moved toward the building and walked through the enormous entrance, into a dark, musty corridor, past an empty nurse's station, past endless open doors that led into utter darkness, and there was a smell, sweet and sickly and disturbing. As she rounded a corner, Alice caught a glimpse of a white gown disappearing through a doorway with a quiet rustle. She chased the nun, hoping for an explanation. Hurrying into the room after her, Alice saw a metal spiral staircase going up into the misty darkness. Looking around, she could not see the nun, so she started up the staircase. A dozen steps up the staircase, there was a clang, and to the step beneath her foot gave way, and Alice plummeted down into the darkness, and she landed on her back on a moving gurney. A ceiling passed above her rapidly, and she jerked as the gurney was pushed through double doors with a bang. Nurses in white habits and doctors in surgical wear surrounded the gurney as it was rushed down a corridor. Confused, Alice looked down at herself and saw that her belly was horribly distended beneath the sheet, almost as if she were pregnant, Alice thought, horrified. You're gonna be all right, one of the doctors said through his green surgical mask. I want you to do exactly what I say. Alice sat up on the gurney and screamed. No, this isn't happening! She froze. The gurney had stopped in the delivery room, and she was staring at a crowd of observers, nurses, doctors, nuns, priests, and herself. The air around her became thick, seemed to shift, and in the blink of an eye she was standing in the group of observers looking at the gurney, where a young woman lay, her face glistening with perspiration, her eyes wide with pain and confusion. The woman, her dark brown hair clinging to her sweaty forehead, looked directly at Alice and hissed, "We must end the evil, you and me. We must! We—" Her body stiffened, and she cried out in pain as she writhed in the clutches of a contraction. "Work with me!" the doctor exclaimed. Come on! Now breathe! Here it comes! Breathe!" The woman jutted her pelvis as the doctor and a white-habited nurse leaned between her legs, and she opened her mouth as if to yawn, cried out in pain, and the doctor groaned. "Sweet Jesus Christ! What is that?" The nurse bundled something in a cloth and held it to her breast, murmuring, "One of God's creatures." The woman on the gurney sat up and said breathlessly, "God had nothing to do with that." The nurse looked at her, shocked, her face turning almost as white as her habit. "That child," the woman gasped, "was conceived in pure evil." The nurse backed away from her, looking down at the baby, and tiny arms jutted from the cloth, and small hands clutched the nurse's throat, making her stumble back against the wall. And as she slid to the floor, the child, the thing, shot from beneath the blanket and scurried across the floor like a giant insect, making a horrible braying sound, as the doctors and other nurses staggered backward, gasping at what they saw. And Alice cried out as the small creature headed toward her, a blur of glistening gray and pink streaking across the floor. And Alice drove out of the way as the creature shot through the delivery room doors, and quickly getting to her feet, Alice turned to see that the delivery room was empty. Frightened but determined, Alice moved toward the swinging double doors of the delivery room and pushed through to see that she was no longer in a hospital. Her surroundings had changed for the worse. Alice now stood in a church. Not just any church. It was the church in which she had last seen Freddy. The church in which she thought she defeated him and freed his young, helpless victims. The dark church echoed with the bone-chilling, animal-like shriek of the child thing that had scurried out of the delivery room a few moments ago. It came from somewhere in the seemingly endless columns of pews. Alice moved up the center aisle with caution, pausing a moment when the shrieking was replaced by an unspeakable wet gulping sound that seemed to draw nearer. Up ahead, in a dusty heap on the floor at the foot of the pulpit, Alice spotted Freddy's remains. The tattered red and green striped sweater, the wrinkled hat and pants, the rusted claw that glimmered dully in a dusty shaft of stained glass light. Alice pressed on, muttering deliberately, "This is over, until the gulping sound stopped and something moved from behind the pulpit. Something small, vaguely human, with gleaming flayed skin. It ran its small tongue around its frayed lips as it moved towards Freddy's remains, and as it neared the small pile, it grew more and more human, taking on the all-too-familiar features of the man, the thing that had once worn those clothes, that claw. Seeing the sense of dark purpose in the creature's eyes, Alice screamed, "No! God damn it, no!" and lunged toward the altar as the creature scurried into Freddy's remains, slobbering as it disappeared beneath the material of the pants, the shirt, and Alice ran up the aisle toward the altar, halted suddenly by the thunderous sound of wood being ripped like paper. The floor beneath the altar was splintering, breaking open, rising up to suddenly form a sort of wooden hill that threw Alice backward and off her feet. She crawled desperately up the growing incline, determined to stop what she was certain was about to happen, what she was certain she was powerless to prevent, all the while thinking, "This can't be happening, I can't be dreaming, I'm not asleep!" Wood groaned and cracked, glass shattered, plumes of choking dust filled the air. Alice clawed at the lifting floor, trying to pull herself up the incline, keeping her eyes on Freddy's clothes as they filled out, as if being inflated, and suddenly the floor fell back into place with a great explosion of sound and dust, and Alice felt the impact through her entire body as dead silence fell over the church. Alice lay on the floor, still for a long moment, then lifted her head. Her eyes fell on Freddy's clawed glove lying beside the altar. A horribly burned hand reached out from behind the pulpit and snatched the glove up with a faint clatter. Alice stiffened, scrambled to her feet, and stared up at the altar. Beams of light filtered through the shifting dust as a vague figure appeared behind the pulpit. Knives scraped over wood. A laugh cut the silence. As the dust cleared, she saw him. Freddy staring down at himself, inspecting his body. Then he smiled at her and quipped, "It's a boy!" "No!" she screamed. "You're dead!" "That never stopped me before!" Growing furious, she shouted, "I closed the door on you!" "Somebody must have, left the key in the lock!" I fought him before, Alice thought, running determinedly up the center aisle. I'll fight him again. But Freddy was gone. The only movement on the altar was dust. "There's no such thing as safe sex," he said, suddenly directly behind her. Alice spun around to see his gruesome, filthy-toothed grin. He cackled as he lifted his razor-fingered hand, and the church doors groaned as they swung open, and a long rectangle of light fell down the center aisle over them. Freddy spun around, and Alice looked to the door to see the woman who had given birth to the child thing. She wore her bloody hospital gown and looked horribly pale. She pointed a finger at Freddy accusingly, and when she spoke, her voice sounded old, so old. "You were conceived in fear and hatred, born in guilt and pain." She changed before Alice's eyes. She became old, her skin wrinkling, sagging, and the hospital gown she wore became a white nun's habit as she said, "I can never forgive you for what you've done." Alice realized that Freddy was backing away slowly, and she saw in his face for the first time ever utter horror. That horror quickly decayed into a burning rage, and he made a hateful sound deep in his throat as he spun around, and in a few quick steps disappeared. Turning to the door again, Alice saw the nun walking away. The door swung closed slowly. "Wait!" Alice called, hurrying after her, throwing the doors open to see the Crave Inn. The diner was completely empty, except for Anne, who tossed an angry glare at Alice from behind the register. Alice looked down at herself to see what she was wearing, the clothes she'd put on for work. "Why is it so empty?" she whispered. "You're over 4 hours late is why," Anne snapped, throwing an apron at Alice. "The party's probably over. You went, didn't you?" Alice didn't catch the apron, and it dropped to the floor. 4 hours? She breathed in a stunned whisper. She looked at the clock. It read 11:15. Chapter 4. Dan lay beside the pool, watching as Yvonne dove gracefully into the water. As the others applauded, Dan's eyes grew heavy and began to close. He figured it must have been the beer that Yvonne had brought. He'd had a couple, and they'd probably made him sleepy. He leaned his head back and allowed himself to relax, to doze. Somewhere in the murky darkness of his nap, a telephone rang. Dan opened his eyes. "So, was I twice cool getting that pool key?" Yvonne asked as she seated herself beside him, dripping wet. "Or was I twice cool?" Mark said.
Beats going over to Dan's and watching his dad's video of every single play Dan ran last season.
The telephone kept ringing. Ringing. And ringing. Greta made a grand entrance then, wearing a beautiful red and black strapless dress.
"Gorgeous as usual,"
Mark whispered. "Thanks," Greta called. Mark blushed, embarrassed that she'd heard him. "Too bad I missed the party getting dressed," she laughed, coming toward them. Dan closed his eyes again as they talked, but was jolted suddenly by Mark. The telephone had stopped ringing, and a jock in t-shirt and cutoffs stood before them. "Dan, you got a phone call in the office," the jock said. As Dan headed for the office, Greta said, Hey, that party Karen's friends are having will still be going. Let's go over there before Officer Bellin gets back. You hate Karen, Yvonne said. Yeah, but I love my new dress. In the cluttered office, Dan picked up the telephone.
Hello?
Dan? It was Alice, and she sounded frantic. It happened again just now, and this time I wasn't even asleep.
What?
Something very weird is happening, Dan. It's Krueger again, but he's stronger, and this time he wants something different.
Where are you?
I'm at work. Please, please hurry. Dan rushed out of the office and past the pool.
Is there a fire?
I've just gotta go. See ya.
In his truck, as he sped through the night, Dan began to feel sleepy again. He turned on the radio with the volume high and caught a call-in talk show. It was one he'd heard before, with a typically abrasive host who abused his guests and callers. Right, lady, the host growled. And Frank Sinatra killed Marilyn because the Kennedys put fluoride in his water. What's the matter, lady? Did you go off your medication? The caller replied urgently. But what the CIA is doing in Central America is a very real issue, and I... You want to talk issues, lady? How about the shit that's issuing from your mouth? Does your asshole ever get jealous of that? He cut her off with a click and said, Springwood, you're on the air. Yes, a woman said. I'm calling about my son. He's an ungrateful bastard. Dan blinked in shock. The voice was so familiar, but it couldn't be. His father and I have slaved to see that he gets a good education, and now he wants to throw his life away and take a worthless little bitch to Europe.
Mom!
Dan barked, nearly swerving the truck. Well, if I were you, lady, the host said, I'd kill the little piggy! Dan quickly changed the station, and loud speed metal pounded from the speakers. His hands trembled as he steered, horrified by his mother's words. His headlights sliced through the night as the truck picked up speed.
Mom.
He whispered, confused and hurt. The truck was going faster now, faster and faster. The music on the radio grew louder, although Dan had not adjusted the volume. Dan started to lift his foot from the gas pedal, but something made a sound on the floorboard, and he looked down to see 4 glistening metal cables with transparent viscous skins snaking out of the floorboard and around his foot, pulling it down on the gas pedal. He cried out, struggling to pull his foot free, but the cables were stronger, and the truck plunged forward, going faster and faster and faster. Something touched his arm, and he looked down in horror as the safety belt slithered around his arms and pried them away from the steering wheel. As the truck careened across the center divider, Dan screamed and struggled with the belts, finally jerking his arms free and trying to regain control of the truck. It was no use. The truck had reached an incredible speed. The hood flew up, obscuring Dan's view, then flew from its hinges and into the night. Everything around Dan became a dark blur until he found himself looking out the windshield at rusted pulley chains hanging from above. The hooks on the ends of the chains clanged against the sides of the truck as it plummeted through them, heading toward an open furnace glowing with flames. As Dan stared into the nearing inferno, he realized with sickening clarity what was happening, and turned to kick his way out the passenger door. But Freddy sat beside him grinning. "Buckle up!" Freddy laughed as the truck crashed into the furnace, into the flames, and screaming, Dan stood up behind the wheel. But the furnace was gone and the truck was speeding down the road again.
Stop it, Krueger!
Dan screamed as the safety belt began to snake over his lap again, moving toward his arms. Reaching for the stick shift to shift down, Dan closed his fist around the gear knob, and long blades sprang from the small plastic sphere and closed like fingers around Dan's hand. They were fingers, Freddy's fingers, and the razor-sharp edges sliced cleanly through Dan's flesh, drawing blood. He slammed his foot onto the brake, and the truck came to such a sudden halt that the rear end rose 3 feet off the road. He looked out the windows to see that he was in the boiler room again, the truck motionless now. The chains and hooks clanged gently against the body of the truck, as if moved by a slight breeze.
Son of a bitch.
Dan hissed, holding his breath. until the chains began to move, wrapping themselves around the truck and becoming tight as they lifted the vehicle off the ground and into the air, moving it slowly toward the raging boiler up ahead. The pickup's interior grew hot quickly as the flames drew nearer, and Dan panicked, fumbling to open the door. But the handle would not budge, and he began kicking the door frantically as the flames licked the truck and slithered across the windshield, shattering the glass, and Dan screamed one final time as he sat up on his towel beside the pool, startled by the ringing of a telephone. His right hand was bleeding. Dan struggled to his feet, hurried into the office, and answered the telephone. "Dan?" Alice asked. You're okay?"
Yeah, I think. I'll tell you when I get there. I'm on my way."
He hung up and rubbed his eyes a moment, breathing deeply. He still felt tired, but he couldn't go back to sleep. He had to get to Alice. Something was very wrong. He started out of the office when a man's voice said quietly, "Cleanup time." Dan froze, certain he was being confronted by Freddy again. He turned to see Officer Belan standing at the edge of the pool. His eyes were narrowed angrily above chubby cheeks, and the lights from beneath the pool cast his shadow on the wall in an enormous wavering blob of darkness. Belan gestured toward the empty beer cans scattered around the pool and said, "You kids have a good time?" "I don't have time for this shit," Dan thought as he bolted for the door. "Hey, come back here," Belan called. Dan jogged across the parking lot toward his truck, knowing the fat little man would never catch up with him. He opened the truck's door, hiked up a leg to get in, but he realized he'd left his keys beside the pool. He turned back to see Belan waddling across the parking lot, huffing and puffing. Turning to Belan's motorcycle parked just a few feet away, he hesitated a moment, then thought, "What the hell," and hopped onto the bike, kicking to life. "Come back with my bike, you little prick!" Belan shouted as Dan roared into the night. As he sped away from the university and headed for the Crave Inn, the motorcycle wobbled indecisively beneath him. The closest Dan had ever come to driving a motorcycle was 5 years ago, when he tried out his cousin's new mini-bike, so he was not feeling very confident. As he began to grow more comfortable on the bike, the front wheel was thrown upward into a wheelie, and the engine gave a bone-shuddering growl as the bike shot down the road at a suddenly accelerated speed, a frightening speed. As he struggled to keep the motorcycle balanced, Dan clutched the brakes, but with no results. The bike moved faster and faster through the night, and the lights of the houses along the road became a creamy blur as the bike's frame began to vibrate dangerously beneath him. He dodged oncoming headlights that shot past him like missiles. When he looked down at the gauges, he saw that each one was trembling at its maximum capacity. When it seemed the motorcycle could go no faster, it increased its speed even more, and Dan felt his face distort as if it were melting beneath the G-forces. Felt his eyes sting, and suddenly the gauges began to spit sparks and their glass faces cracked, and Dan struggled to look down as the gauges sizzled and melted into glistening mounds of liquid metal and plastic, undulating wetly, beginning to slowly change shape, almost as if they were taking on facial features. Almost, but not quite human features.
"Krueger!"
Dan screamed as the face grinned up at him from the space occupied moments ago by the bike's gauges. The brake lever on the handlebars split with a metallic clang into 4 long shiny blades and clamped down over Dan's hands, pressing harder and harder until they cut into the flesh between his knuckles, and rib-like ridges rose up from the glossy black gas tank, creating a sort of torso beneath the grinning face. The torso began to expand and contract with deep breaths. The ribs extended downward on each side of the bike, forming organic breathing pipes that disappeared into the bike's engine, and each pipe began to bulge and throb as if something were pressing to get out, until new exhaust pipes appeared with a sound like splintering bone. They began to grow a deep, burning red as they grew hotter and hotter, until they wrapped around Dan's bare legs, blackening his skin with a crackling sizzle, and the claws on the handlebars reached up suddenly, grabbed Dan's shoulders, and jerked him down until his tortured face was inches from Freddy's. "Let the good times roll!" Freddy laughed, pushing him upright again, and Dan screamed as the claws raked down his bare arms, cutting red trails through the flesh as the pipes burned into his legs, cooking their way through the muscle tissue, and his scream became a pathetic gurgle in his throat when he saw the headlights of his own truck rushing head-on toward the motorcycle, and metal screamed and glass shattered as Dan tumbled from the bike and broke through the windshield of his truck, landing upright behind the wheel as the truck sped on into the night. He clutched the wheel and felt for the brake pedal to slow the truck. Something moved beside him. He glanced to his right to see Freddy leaning casually against the passenger door as lights streaked by outside. He hissed,
"Freddy says, don't dream and drive!"
He pointed ahead through the windshield, and Dan followed his gaze as a monstrous semi thundered down on them, its horn roaring, and Dan screamed,
Alice!
as Alice slapped a juicy pink hamburger patty onto the grill and pressed it down with a spatula as the radio played tiny rock and roll. As the meat sizzled, she picked up the coffee pot to pour a cup for her single last night customer, when suddenly the room seemed to melt around her, and the sounds, the sizzling burger and the radio decayed into warbling gurgles, and Alice dropped the coffee pot to the floor as the wall ahead of her melted away like hot wax, and she was looking down a long deserted road beneath a starry sky. Far up ahead, headlights appeared like pinpricks of light. They grew larger and larger, larger still, and she recognized Dan's truck, began to hear his voice,
Alice! Alice!
and even saw his face more and more clearly as the truck bore down on her at an incredible speed, and just as she noticed Dan was not alone inside the truck, it reached her, looked as if it might run her down, but instead it disappeared, leaving only Dan's face before her, growing larger and larger until it completely filled her vision, and then it stopped, cried,
Alice!
one more time, then began to fall away from her, and she tried unsuccessfully to catch him as Dan fell down a long, pink, membranous tunnel. The walls pulsated around it. Juices glistened as they gathered between the folds of the smooth pink membrane, and as Dan disappeared, Alice doubled over suddenly, clutching her stomach as a deadly pain ripped through her abdomen. She staggered against the counter, crying out in pain, gasping for breath until the pain passed. When she stood, the image was gone. She was back in the diner, and her customer was leaning over the counter, calling, "You okay, honey? Honey, you okay? You want me to call?" "No!" she shouted, dashing toward the door. "No! No! Please, God, no!" Feeling sick with dread, she ran into the street and looked in the direction from which she knew Dan would come. Alice clawed her face and screamed. Several hundred yards down the street, a jackknife semi was curled around a flaming wad of crumpled metal. A jammed horn wailed in the night. Panicking, Alice ran toward the accident, and the horn grew louder in her ears as she rounded the truck, and a man lurched from around the corner, his face badly cut and bleeding. He grabbed Alice's shoulders and shook her, screaming. "He came out of nowhere, like he was going 1,000 miles an hour, like he was on a fucking rocket to hell!" Sirens grew closer as Alice tore herself away from the hysterical truck driver and turned to see Dan. She staggered backward, bile rising from her guts. His face was gone, so was part of his head. He was pinned in the mass of charred metal, and the fire was toying with his skin. Alice spun away from it as the night filled with flashing red and blue lights. She dropped to her knees, and then the pavement began to fly up towards her face. Alice passed out. Chapter 5. Alice opened her eyes to see Yvonne sitting beside her bed wearing her white uniform and name tag. Yvonne stood and touched Alice's arm, whispered, "God, Alice, I'm so... It took a moment for realization to wash over Alice, but when it did, when she remembered the horrible vision she'd had and the carnage she'd seen in the street outside the Crave Inn, she sat bolt upright and hissed, "It was Freddy. My God, he used to do it when I was asleep. Just when I was asleep, but something's changed that. Hey, slow down. You're not making sense. Where am I? In the hospital. Under observation? How did Dan die? Yvonne blinked at her, confused, and said, In an accident with a semi. Yeah, see? He can do that. Make your dream death look like something real. Alice's panic gathered like phlegm in her throat, and her words stammered to a halt. When Yvonne glanced across the room, Alice followed her gaze and saw a long rectangular window. On the other side of the glass stood her dad, the Jordans, and a tall, balding man in a white coat with the stethoscope dangling from the coat's pocket. Look, maybe I'd better go get Dr. Morris, Yvonne said. Alice snapped. No, maybe you'd better listen to me, because he's just getting started. The door was pushed open, and Alice's dad followed the doctor into the room. The doctor's name tag read Dr. L. Morris. When her dad took her hand, Alice ignored the doctor and whispered, Daddy, it started again, like before, with Rick and everybody. Daddy, please tell them what happened. As Alice spoke, Dr. Morris stood at the foot of her bed and watched her intently, chewing his lower lip. When she was finished, her dad looked at the doctor, who said to Alice quietly, You've had a terrible shock. Then to her father he said, This sort of outburst is often more dramatic than serious. Many women experience moments of mild hysteria in the first few months, even those who haven't suffered a traumatic shock. It's really nothing to worry about. Alice felt dizzy with confusion and breathed, Daddy! When he averted his eyes, she turned to Dr. Morris. You blacked out, the doctor said. I wanted to do a full checkup. What? Why? What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, he said with a shrug. You're pregnant. A numbness overwhelmed Alice as she gaped at Dr. Morris. He went on. We're going to keep you here overnight just for observation to make sure you're well and comfortable. The doctor's last words were a muffled hum. Alice stared, as if looking straight through him, and mumbled to herself over and over again, Pregnant. Pregnant? Alice was ready to leave the hospital just before dawn the next morning. Yvonne breezed into her room and said, You got everything you need? Yeah. I gotta start my rounds. I'll check up on you later. We can leave together when my shift's over. As Yvonne started to leave, Alice called her name softly, and she turned, smiling. I don't feel anything, Alice whispered. What? Well, I want to be happy about the baby because it's Dan's baby, but I just feel sort of angry. Angry that Dan's dead. Angry that I traded him for this life that I don't even know, but that's all I feel, anger. I can't seem to feel anything else. Yvonne hesitated a moment, then said, I think right now is a little too soon to be thinking about any of this. Am I right? Alice nodded half-heartedly. Look, I'll be right back when I'm done with my rounds. Why don't you get some rest? Yvonne? She stopped and turned in the doorway again. I told you about him, Freddy, and I'd like to tell everyone else. I need to, as soon as they let me out of here. Yvonne looked around the room as if embarrassed, then said abruptly, I've got to start my rounds. She left the room quickly. Alice sat on the edge of her bed and with a sigh put her face in her hands. It was the same thing all over again. No one would believe her. They would think she was crazy, and the deaths would go on and on and on. Hi. She lifted her head with a gasp and saw a little boy standing in the open doorway. He was frail-looking with an angelic quality about him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and he wore a white hospital gown, which made him look sort of like a little ghost. But even more unsettling were his eyes. One was green, the other blue. Hello? She said tentatively. They looked at one another for a long moment. She, uncertain, and he, with a gentle smile on his lips, before she spoke again. Are you a patient here? Yeah, I guess so. What's your name? Jacob? Jacob, well, that's a nice name. She waited for him to speak again. When he didn't, she asked, Should you be out of your room right now, Jacob? Oh, I'm not that far away from it. Would your mom want you in here? I don't know, he said a little sadly. His eyebrows lifted and he said abruptly, Your boyfriend died in a car wreck, huh? Alice flinched at his words. How did you know that? I'm sorry it happened. I just wanted to see if you were all right. With that, he smiled bashfully and turned to leave. Wait, Jacob, Alice called. You don't have to go. But he was gone. As they left the hospital together later that morning, Alice asked Yvonne, Hey, you know a little kid named Jacob? Maybe 6 or 7? He's got different colored eyes? 7's a little young for me, Yvonne chuckled as they got into the elevator. What about him? He came to my room after you left this morning. He was in a hospital gown. I just wondered what was wrong with him. Well, aside from the fact that there are no visitors allowed in the building between 9 at night and 9 in the morning, and that there's no children's wing in this hospital, absolutely nothing, far as I know. Alice frowned, confused. You're sure? Positive. The elevator stopped and opened, and Yvonne said, Come on, everybody's waiting for us at the Crave Inn. When she was finished telling her story in the Crave Inn, Alice looked around the table from Yvonne to Greta to Mark, who squinted and said in a somewhat embarrassed voice,
Look, Alice, a guy out of your dreams did not kill Dan. It was an accident.
Mark, this isn't something new, she said, trying to be patient. Didn't you ever hear what happened to my brother and my friends? Didn't Dan ever tell you about it? He shook his head.
He never wanted to talk about it.
The disbelief in the faces around the table frightened her. She expected it, but it frightened her nonetheless. Look, you guys, she said, I'm not making this up. He gets in through me, through my dreams. I bring other people to him. It's something I thought I could control, something I could fight, but... Her voice trailed off. Greta said firmly, Alice, when Dan had that accident, you weren't dreaming. You were here, at work, am I right? Alice nodded reluctantly, because that was the confusing part, the part she couldn't understand. It had never happened while she was awake before. So, Greta went on, how did he...
There isn't any how or he.
Mark interrupted adamantly. He took Alice's hand and squeezed it affectionately, trying to hide the irritation in his voice.
You've been through a lot, Alice. We all know that. But don't let it get to you. Don't let it do this to you.
Alice tried to hold back her tears of frustration and dread. They weren't believing her, and she was afraid for them. Alice was in the kitchen pouring cream into a cup of coffee when her dad got home. He hugged 2 grocery bags to his chest and set them down on the kitchen table. Had your dinner yet? He asked flatly. She hesitated, unsure of his mood. No, I was waiting for you to get home from your meeting. Get a spoon. He reached into one of the bags. She took a spoon from the drawer and asked, What's this? Practice. He removed several jars of baby food from the bag. She stared at them, a little confused at first, then very apprehensive. Don't worry, he said with a wink, something he hadn't done since she was a little girl. You don't have to turn into Supermom overnight. This hasn't exactly been the best weekend of your life. I just thought you'd like to, well, start with the peaches. They were always your favorite. He managed a slight smile, more than he usually did, and looked away from her, embarrassed. She felt a rush of love for him and stepped forward, giving him a quick kiss on the cheek. Then she opened a jar of mashed peaches and dug in. Chapter 6. The day of Dan's funeral, Greta Gibson was miserable. Actually, miserable was too tame a word. Her mother, who insisted that Greta call her by her first name, Racine, rather than mother or mom, was throwing one of her famous dinner parties. At least they were famous among the circles of people who attended them. But they were not the kind of people with whom Greta preferred to associate. They were what she called trendies, and she despised them. What she despised even more was the fact that her mother had been trying for all of Greta's life to turn her into one of them. True, it was Greta's ambition to be a fashion model. She looked forward with great excitement to posing for the cameras. But it was also true that a career as a model would require her to hang out with more trendies. Greta saw that as a severe drawback. Racine knew that and was trying to change her mind about the trendies, trying to groom her for the future. Greta was seated at the opposite end of the table from Racine, hoping to avoid being noticed by any of her mother's friends. At the other end of the room, Racine talked about Greta with a man dressed in an Italian suit. His sandy hair was ultra-short, and he wore glasses with large red trendy frames. He nodded a lot and glanced from Racine to Greta and back again. He leaned toward Racine, murmured something, and she grinned, replying, "You know you're right. People are always mistaking us for sisters." Greta looked at her mother with distaste. The woman was a few years past 40 and didn't look at all like Greta's sister. Greta looked around at the decor with equal distaste. She thought of it as wannabe Manhattan, a lot of cold, artificial-looking Korean high-tech furniture, and she decided the guest matched it perfectly, cold and artificial. The man at the end of the table, his name was Lorne, and he was a sort of New Age past-life therapist, smiled at Greta and said, "You're not eating. Are you a vegetarian?" "Greta's more of a nothingtarian," Racine said. "You know, Greta, dear, you should at least try the monk fish. It's imported." Greta resisted, rolling her eyes in disgust. Racine was always harping on her to keep her figure. "For the cameras," she'd say, but at the same time she was always harping on her to eat. It made no sense. A woman to Greta's left, named Jody, whose clothes were a cross between Beverly Hills chic and gypsy audacity, said, "You know, Greta does have the perfect body for modeling. In fact, I'm in New York quite often. I see Eileen Ford from time to time. I'd be happy to talk to her about you." She smiled at Greta, flashing capped teeth beneath an adjusted nose. Greta smiled half-heartedly and looked down at her plate, toying with her food. "Greta," Racine drawled, "Jody is offering you the chance of a lifetime." She turned to Jody and said, "All Greta ever talks about is making it in Manhattan." The truth was, Greta seldom talked to her mother, because she never had anything to say that Racine wanted to hear. All she wanted to hear was trendy gossip about trendy people. Greta felt a surge of anger, and let her fork clatter onto her plate as she said deliberately, "We buried one of my best friends today, Mother!" There was a flustered silence around the table. Lorne broke it by muttering, "The Jordan boy, a good ball player," Racine said stiffly. "Rick Jordan was a—" "Dan!" Greta interrupted. "Dan Jordan!" "He was a good friend of Greta's," Racine continued. "Not someone she was seeing, you understand, just a friend." A man who looked like someone in a yuppie beer commercial said, "It's reminiscent of Fitzgerald, although in his stories it's generally the women who die violently." "My God, I haven't read Fitzgerald in ages," said a woman who looked like a department store mannequin. "All I really remember about him is that everyone in his books is over the hill by the time they're 19. Is that right? I remember reading once that Fitzgerald—" They were off again, having another trendy conversation about another trendy subject. Greta stared at her plate, feeling tired. She hadn't slept well since Dan's death. How could she, the way Alice was carrying on? But she suddenly felt unbearably tired. She closed her eyes just for a moment, tuning out the droning voices around her, trying not to think about where she was, and she jerked her head up suddenly with a start. Racine's face was inches from Greta's. She was standing beside Greta, leaning forward with a stern look on her face, hissing, "You've got to at least try the fish. Our guest will think there's something wrong with it." "Yes," Lorne prodded at the other end of the table. "Come on, have a little." To keep peace, Greta begrudgingly cut off a tiny piece of fish. As if he were talking to a child, the yuppie beer commercial man said, Good, see?" He popped a morsel into his mouth and chewed loudly. Sickened by the man's patronizing attitude, Greta put her fork down. Racine said, "Would you like me to have the caterer bring in something else?" She called over her shoulder, "Frederick!" The name sent a chill down Greta's spine. She looked down at the table, taking in a deep breath as her mother took her plate away and another hand replaced it with a new one, a horribly scarred hand wearing a glove that had knives attached to the fingers. Greta sucked in a breath sharply and looked up, but the kitchen door was already swinging closed and the caterer was gone. She looked down at the plate again. It was covered with 4 piles of different kinds of mush, like baby food. "Little Greta gonna clean her plate for Mommy like a good girl," Racine cooed, scooping some of the mush into a spoon and lifting it to Greta's mouth. Disgusted, Greta turned her head away and tried to lift a hand to push the spoon from her mouth, but she couldn't move either of her arms. She looked down and saw that she was sitting in a filthy, rusted old high chair, and her arms were held down beneath the dirty tray that covered her lap. Greta froze for a moment, thinking, Wait just a minute. "Come on, a big bite for Mommy Wommy," Racine said, pressing the spoon of goop to Greta's lips. With little choice in the matter, Greta opened her mouth and took in the slop. Some of it spattered on her chin. Racine drawled, "There's Mommy's good girl." Scooping up another spoonful of the stuff, she shoved it hard into Greta's mouth before Greta could resist, then scooped up another. She pushed spoonful after spoonful into Greta's mouth, pressing the spoon to the roof of her mouth before slipping it out and dribbling the goop on her chin. Bits of it clung to Greta's face as she struggled in the high chair, trying to cry out but unable to make anything more than a gargling sound. Glops of the slimy substance slapped onto Greta's dress and splashed on her arms. She thought she could almost feel it caking on her, growing dry and crusty. All the while the trendies seated around the table smiled and nodded. Some of them even broke into quiet applause now and then. Greta jerked her head back and forth and finally spat out a mouthful of the goop, clenching her eyes shut and trying to speak, to protest. But when she opened her eyes, she gasped because a wiry man with horribly burned skin, wearing a tattered hat and an old red and green sweater, stood before her. He lifted a hand, and it was the hand, the razor-clawed hand she'd seen a few moments ago, the hand Alice had spoken of, and the man grinned as he moved the hand toward her face so she could see what he held delicately between his thumb and forefinger. It was a tiny miniature version of herself, squirming and crying out in agony and fear.
"You are what you eat!"
He chuckled, using his other hand to force her mouth open. Greta tried to scream, tried to call for her mother, even for Alice, but nothing came from her mouth except little bits of the mush her mother had been feeding her. She struggled, trying to fight his iron grip, but it was useless. He pried her mouth open, held the tiny creature. "Me," she thought frantically, "that's me!" and plopped it onto her tongue, then pressed her jaw up until her teeth clacked together. She felt the miniature version of herself squirming in her clamped mouth and tried to lower her jaw again, but Freddy's grip was too strong. The thing in her mouth crawled backward down her tongue, squirming, wriggling, until it slid down her throat, and then it stopped. She tried to take in a breath, but couldn't. She tried to exhale, but could not. It was lodged in her throat, writhing, kicking and scratching, crying out in a needle-thin voice. The guests at the table smiled wider, laughed louder, applauded harder, and Greta strangled.
"Bon appetit, bitch!"
The baby food wasn't bad. It wasn't bad at all. Alice opened a third jar, and as she twisted the jar's lid, It made a muffled burping sound, and yellow vomitous mush slapped onto the wall before her. She stared at it as it oozed down the wall slowly. Then she realized that the baby food was not dribbling toward the floor, but moving with purpose over the wall, taking shape, forming a set of long vertical lips like a mouth, except it wasn't a mouth because the lips split, forming several flowery, delicate folds that opened, and Greta's head and shoulders oozed from between them, and she screamed, "Alice! Help me! Help me!" She reached out a hand as the lips began to close around her again, sucking her back in with horrible slurping sounds. Alice lunged forward and grabbed Greta's arms, pulling with all of her might, but they were slippery and she quickly lost her grip. Instead, she reached forward and wrapped her fingers around the fleshy lips and tried to pry them apart, pulling harder and harder until they finally gave and opened up. But before Alice could grab a hold of her, Greta fell away from her, screaming as she disappeared down the long membranous tunnel in which she'd seen Dan fall only days before. Holding the enormous lips open, Alice screamed, "Greta! Greta, I'm sorry, Greta!" The lips slapped shut and disappeared. Alice stood in the kitchen a moment, then spun around and screamed for her dad, but she could hear the shower hissing upstairs and turned instead to the telephone, grabbed the receiver and began punching in Greta's number. But before she was finished, her insides were seized by a sharp pain that tightened its grip until she dropped the receiver and lurched forward, leaning against the wall. She fell to her knees and cried out, and then it was gone. She leaned back against the cupboards with a quavering sigh and breathed, "Dear God, what's happening?" Chapter 7. Mark heard someone coming up the stairs to his room and quickly lifted a comic book in front of his face. He'd been lying on his bed crying softly for over an hour.
How could it happen? With all those people at the table, how could it happen?
He'd heard about Greta's death that morning and had been devastated. He'd stayed in his room all day. Mark's room was actually the attic that he'd converted into a sort of studio apartment. It was cluttered with his drawing table that he'd built a platform bed for his king-size mattress, with the rickety ladder leading up from the floor. The whole thing was precariously nailed together, but for all its creaking and wobbling, it seemed sturdy enough. There was a knock at the door and Alice called. "Mark, are you all right?"
Sure.
He said quickly, wiping his eyes.
Come on in.
She came in, followed by Yvonne in her nurse's uniform. "You mind if we stick around for a while?" Yvonne asked.
If you want.
He did not take his eyes from the comic book. He was afraid to look at them, afraid they'd know. The bed creaked and jittered as they climbed up the ladder and sat down beside him. "You know," Yvonne said, "someday this whole thing's gonna fall flat. You ought to nail it together better." He shrugged, still staring blindly at the comic book. They were silent for the longest time. It was a silence filled with the unspoken but deafening grief they all felt. Finally, Alice whispered, "She must have fallen asleep at the table. That's the only explanation I can..." As her voice trailed off, Mark finally looked up from his comic book and glared at her, waiting, just waiting for her to mention one word about that stupid nightmare story of hers. "But," she went on, "I still don't know why this is happening while I'm awake. I've got to figure out how he's getting in." Mark threw his comic book against the wall and snapped.
I really don't need to hear this shit now, okay?
"But it's true, Mark," she hissed. "I have one dream about Krueger, and a few days later, 2 of us are dead."
Alice, will you just shut up?
Mark shouted, clenching his fist. She was startled by his outburst. He looked at her and continued quietly.
I loved Greta. I know I never stood a chance in hell with her, but I loved her. And now I'm having,
He fought back his tears, sickened by them.
I'm having a hard enough time dealing with the fact that she choked to death on a fucking piece of fish. And I don't need to hear your bullshit about some asshole from your dreamland. want to be left alone, okay?
Alice reached out tentatively and squeezed his shoulder, nodding. Then she and Yvonne climbed carefully down the ladder. Mark lifted the comic book again and tried to at least look at the pictures, but his eyes blurred with tears. He felt sick inside, knotted up, and he didn't want to be alone. He sat up quickly and said,
Hey, would you guys mind, just hanging around for a while? We wouldn't have to talk if you don't want to.
I've got to go to work, Yvonne said apologetically. Alice smiled. I'll stay. A few hours later, hours of talking about Greta and their times together, Mark sat down at his drawing table and Alice looked over his shoulder as he paged through a book he'd been preparing for Greta. It was filled with drawings of all of them, Mark, Greta, Yvonne, Alice, and Dan.
I was going to finish it up. Our senior year adventures. Something like that. And, well, I wanted to give it to her before she went to New York, but...
She would have liked that, Alice whispered. It's very good, really. He closed the book gently, set it down beside a drawing of his own house, and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. Then smiled up at Alice and said,
So, pregnant, huh?
Yeah, and having a little trouble getting used to the idea.
Well, I think it's great. I kind of think that, well, Dan would have liked that too.
Alice stifled a yawn and stretched her arms above her head.
Tired?
Mark asked.
My dad usually got some coffee in the pot by now.
I'll go get us some, Alice said, heading for the door. I'll be right back. Mark watched her go, glad that he'd asked her to stay. He felt pretty tired himself. Not actually sleepy, but like he needed to lie down. He took off his shoes and socks, climbed onto his bed, and curled up. Just for a few minutes, until Alice got back. A few minutes later, Alice climbed the stairs with 2 steaming cups of coffee, and entered Mark's room, saying, Here it is, piping hot and good to the last drop. She looked around, but could find Mark nowhere. She called his name a couple of times, turning around and around, searching the room for him. Mark was gone. She set the coffee cups down on his drawing table and gasped when she saw that the drawing of Mark's house was moving. The house was decomposing, coming to pieces, then reforming into a picture of another house, an old, run-down, boarded-up house. Freddy's house. On the porch lay a typical welcome mat, but from the mat rose tiny, rusted metal spikes that looked sharp as needles. As if being stretched rapidly by an invisible hand and pen, a figure appeared before the house. Mark. Damn it, Krueger, no! She shouted. In the picture, Mark stood before the house, looking around in confusion, then started to step toward the door, toward the mat. No, Mark, don't! Alice cried, stepping away from the table and shutting her eyes tightly, concentrating on Mark and the Krueger house with every ounce of her strength, until the air around her seemed to be sucked out of the room with a deafening whoosh, and a heartbeat later, Alice was sucked out with it, pulled backward so hard and fast that her hair slapped around her head, and her arms and legs flew forward, until she was standing a few feet behind Mark in front of the ominous gray house, and he was about to step onto the spiked welcome mat in his bare feet, as she threw herself forward, shouting, Don't, Mark! But it was too late. Mark's foot pressed down on the mat, and blood began to pool immediately between the small rusted spikes. Mark froze, with his other foot held inches above the mat, looked down confused, then whimpered,
Ow!
As if he did not yet understand the source of the pain. Mark put his other foot down, then reached for the doorknob. Alice clutched his shoulders and said, Mark! Mark, do you hear me? Wake up! He looked at her as if she were a stranger and blinked several times.
Alice?
He said finally, looking around with growing shock at his surroundings. Wake up, Mark! Wake up now before he comes!
Who comes?
Freddy!
Alice?
He whispered as his eyes narrowed in pain.
My feet. My feet, Alice.
He looked down slowly and, Then he was gone in a vaporous puff. Relieved, Alice faced the house and, burning with anger, growled, "All right, Krueger, you son of a bitch!" She stepped over the mat, threw the door open, and stalked into the house. "You stay away from me, Krueger!" she shouted as she went down the hall, throwing doors open and checking each room for a sign of Freddy's presence. She went upstairs to continue her search. "Stay out of my life! Leave my friends alone!" She burst into a musty old bedroom, found nothing, then into another room, finding only cobwebs and covered furniture. Beyond the door at the end of the hall she found a steep, narrow staircase. It was treacherously dark, but she climbed the creaky stairs to the attic above and opened the door. Plumes of dust rolled into the air like a mist, dancing in the beam of light that shined in through a broken window. "Where are you, Freddy?" she said quietly. The tears in her eyes did not help her to sound very convincing when she declared, "I'm not afraid of you, not any more." The skittering of a rat in a dark corner was the only response. Deciding it was pointless to go on searching, Alice turned and Jacob said, "Hi." She gasped and staggered backward, slapping a hand over her pounding chest. "You scared me, Jacob. What are you doing here?" "Dan would have wanted me to be with you." He stood in the doorway, still wearing his hospital gown, still pale, and looking even more sickly than he had before. "You knew Dan?" Alice asked suspiciously. "Kind of." "Does your mom know where you are, that you're here?" "My mom's too busy to care where I am." Alice knelt down before him and whispered, "Oh, I'm sure she cares." "It doesn't matter. I've got a new friend now. He knows all kinds of neat games." Alice ignored his words. She was too full of questions about this odd child. She finally asked, "Who are you, Jacob?" He smiled again. "I'm sorry about your friend Greta." "How did you know about that?" Again he ignored her question, turning with childlike preoccupation to look down the stairs behind him. "Hey, he's gone! My friend's gone!" Without so much as a glance back at Alice, the boy hurried down the stairs and disappeared into the hungry darkness. "Jacob!" she called, following him. "You shouldn't be alone in here! Jacob! Jacob! Where are you go—" The dark attic stairway was gone, and Alice stood before Mark's drawing table. There was a loud creaking sound above her, and she looked up with a gasp as Mark sat up in his bed and looked down at her with confused and sleepy eyes. He swung his legs off the bed. His feet were bleeding from small puncture wounds. "How could it have happened?" Alice breathed, talking to herself as she paced. I was awake. How could it... He was there in the house. I know he was, but then... Where did he go? Why didn't he come for us? And why was Jacob there?"
My feet.
Mark whispered, examining his injuries. He looked down at her with confusion and fear.
Alice, my feet. It was real. I thought I was dreaming, but... Alice? Maybe you ought to tell me a little bit more about this.
Chapter 8. When Yvonne's shift ended early the next morning, she went straight to the university locker room and changed from her uniform into a bikini. It had been a rough night, and she was looking forward to a long rest in the steam room, then a few laps around the pool. In the steam room, she sat with her back to the wall, hugging one leg to her breasts. She needed some time alone, away from work and even her friends. She'd been so busy lately, she'd had no time to just relax and think a while. About Dan, about Greta. The hot steam massaged her stiff muscles, loosened them, relieved their aches, wrapped her in a blanket of clinging warmth. She leaned her head back, closed her eyes, and sat up with a gasp, drenched with perspiration. "Damn!" she hissed, chiding herself for falling asleep. She couldn't afford to spend the whole morning in the steam room. Yvonne stood and left the room, went to the pool and climbed up the diving board. Still feeling groggy, she stopped to rub her eyes before walking out onto the board, and the diving board lurched suddenly, nearly knocking her over the side to the concrete 30 feet below. She clutched the railing and screamed as the board began to shake violently, and the metal girders that supported it groaned loudly, as if under a tremendous strain. Yvonne leaned against the railing, hugging it desperately, and looked over the side as the girders beneath her began to wilt slowly, as if they were melting. They swayed this way, that way, then began to move faster, whipping the board back and forth. She clutched the railing even harder, until it snapped off in her arms like a frail piece of plastic. And Yvonne pressed herself flat against the board, face down, hugging it for life, when the board itself began to break up, cracking loudly and separating into 4 long, narrow sections which spread apart slowly, farther and farther apart, like 4 enormous fingers. "No!" Yvonne screamed so loudly that her throat hurt. This can't be happening!" Giant curved knives sprang from the ends of the 4 sections as they curled slowly around her. Yvonne looked over her shoulder as one of the girders shot upward from the back of the board and bent as if jointed like a thumb. "No, please God, no!" she screamed, closing her eyes as the hand closed slowly. "Somebody help me, please, somebody!" The platform gave a tremendous jerk, and Yvonne suddenly sensed movement, upward movement. She opened her eyes to see that the diving board, or what had once been a diving board, was shooting up at an incredible speed. The pole was growing smaller and more distant beneath her, and when she looked up, the ceiling was growing rapidly closer. And Yvonne, realizing she was about to be crushed like a fly against the ceiling, scrambled desperately toward the edge of the giant hand that held her, throwing herself off and falling down toward the pool, falling faster and faster, and she screamed when she saw that the pool was empty. She was plummeting toward the light blue concrete floor of the pool faster and faster, and as she fell, screaming, she saw something very strange. In the middle of the pool floor, the concrete surface was shifting, forming rounded ridges that somehow resembled lips. The lips separated into an oval-shaped opening that led to an endless tunnel with glistening pink walls that seemed to pulse. Yvonne fell farther and farther, as if she would never land, and as she stared down at what she was certain would be her death, the opening in the pool exploded with a thick black-red liquid that gushed upward like a geyser, spraying into the air and covering the light blue floor, rising quickly until it was sloshing against the pool walls, nearly filling it. Blood. The pool was filling with blood. The black-red surface flew up at Yvonne with lightning speed, and she fell into the pool of blood with a thick splash. She began kicking and flailing her arms, trying to keep her head above the surface so she could breathe. Her hair pressed slickly to her face as she struggled, but her efforts were doing very little, if any good, because below her she felt a powerful swirl in the pool, and realized that all around her, the level of blood against the pool walls was lowering. The strange opening in the bottom of the pool had stopped gushing blood. It was now sucking the blood back out again. Yvonne felt herself being pulled toward the center of the pool and sucked under the viscous, lumpy surface of blood. She fought harder, sweeping her arms at her sides, frantically trying to steer herself to the pool's edge. In spite of the tremendous pull beneath her, she managed to inch her way to the side of the pool, closer, a little closer, until she was close enough to reach out and slap her hands onto the concrete. She clutched the lift that surrounded the pool and began pulling with all of her strength to lift herself out of the mire, when 2 feet appeared before her. Above the viscous slurping sounds that came from the pool, Yvonne heard a sinister laugh as Freddy hunkered down in front of her. Propped an elbow on his knee and clanged his blades together as he said,
Careful! There's an underflow!
"No!" she cried. "Please help me! Please help me!" He reached out his right arm and delicately scraped his blades over the back of her left hand, laughing. The stinging pain made her scream, and when she saw the blood, her own blood, Yvonne lost her grip and, sat up screaming in the steam room with a little cry, froze and looked around her. When she realized that she'd fallen asleep and dreamed it all, she relaxed with a loud sigh and scrubbed her face with her moist palms. But her relief was short-lived. A chill crept over her in spite of the steam room's heat, and she whispered, "Oh my God!" It's true, she thought. Everything Alice said is true. Chapter 9. "He was just like you said," Yvonne whispered over the counter to Alice that afternoon in the Crave Inn. "He was horribly burned, and he had those awful knives on his hand, and—" She extended her left arm, pulled back the bandage on her hand, and showed Alice the cuts. "He did this." Alice stared at the cuts with a sinking feeling in her stomach and said, "I'm glad that's all he did. You're lucky to be alive. I just don't understand how he's getting in when I'm awake. He'd trick you into pulling friends into your dreams while you slept. Then he'd kill them, right?" "Right. But now he's getting to them while I'm awake. First Stan, then Greta, he almost got Mark, and then you. Next, he's liable to come after me while I'm awake. Me and my baby." She breathed. A frightening thought hit her hard, and she covered her mouth with a palm. "Oh my God, Yvonne. Do unborn babies dream?" Yvonne's eyes widened with stunned realization. "Yeah, they do. About 3/4 of their lives in the womb." Alice swept a hand through her hair, chewing her lip, and asked, "Can you reach Dr. Morris?" "Well, it's Sunday. I can try him at home." Taking off her apron, Alice said, "If Freddy's gotten into the baby's dreams, he could be doing something to my baby." Yvonne smiled slightly. "Your baby? The baby you don't feel anything for?" Alice smiled, too, realizing that she did indeed feel something for the baby. She felt a great deal. "I just want to know right away, all right? If that's what Freddy's doing, maybe we can stop him." "From the tone of your voice, Yvonne," Dr. Morris said, seated on the corner of his desktop and frowning with irritation, "I expected some kind of emergency, but I don't see anything about Alice that would make ultrasound necessary this early in the pregnancy. And it certainly isn't necessary on Sunday afternoon." Alice said, "I want to make sure my baby's all right." Dr. Morris sighed and rolled his eyes. "Listen, Alice, I can assure you that—" "Do unborn babies dream, Dr. Morris?" she asked, interrupting him. In a flat, annoyed voice, the doctor replied, "Approximately 78% of their day. There's even been some research supporting the concept of a dream link between the child and mother. A sort of psychic, umbilical cord." "I don't understand." "Well, there may be times when a mother is actually able to experience her unborn baby's dreams." He frowned again, looking back and forth between Yvonne and Alice. "Is that why you interrupted my tennis game? Because you're afraid your baby's having nightmares?" "We're here to find out everything we can, Doctor." Then Yvonne said, "And the thing of it is, we're kind of in a hurry, so maybe you could give Alice the test first and yell at us later?" He stood. "Well, now that my afternoon's ruined anyway, I might as well." Mark was exhausted. He'd been guzzling coffee all day, and as a result he had a headache, and his hands were trembling. He hadn't slept last night, hadn't allowed himself to sleep, now that he knew his dreams were dangerous. To keep himself occupied, he'd been working furiously, drawing a single picture over and over again, each time from a different angle. The house he'd seen in his dream with the rusty spiked welcome mat before the door. He began to nod sleepily over his work and sat up with a jerk, yawning, then sipping his coffee. As he set his cup down again, he noticed a comic book on his table that he hadn't seen before. He picked it up and read the title, written in red dripping letters on the cover, Krueger's Nightmares from Hell. Curious, he opened it at random and gasped when he saw a drawing of Greta in an enormous high chair, her white bloated face covered with dribbling lumps of food. Horrified, Mark flipped through the comic book and saw a drawing of Dan in the clutches of a motorcycle with hideous human features, and Yvonne diving into an empty swimming pool with an enormous vaginal-like opening in the bottom, and himself. The drawing depicted Mark at his drawing table, reading a comic book. It was followed by several blank panels. He took in a breath and whispered,
Oh my god.
A terribly scarred hand tore out of the comic book's pages and slapped onto Mark's face, the fingers digging into his flesh, and as Mark screamed, the hand pulled with tremendous strength, ripping Mark from his chair and into the comic book. He was tossed through the air and back into his own room, except it wasn't really his room. It was a two-dimensional illustration of his room, drawn in the exaggerated perspective of a comic book. He hit the floor hard and landed against his drawing table, which ripped like paper. It was paper, a drawing rather than an actual tangible piece of furniture. He heard an ominous ripping sound and, sprawled on the floor, looked up to see that 4 blades were cutting through the paper wall. Evil eyes peered through the cuts, and Mark heard a laugh. Scrambling to his feet, Mark ran to the door, but he couldn't turn the knob because there was nothing to turn, nothing to grab hold of. It was just a drawing. Behind him, Freddy's knives continued to slice the paper. Then he stepped into the room and laughed uproariously. Lying on her back, Alice watched the ultrasound screen, enchanted as she listened to the sound of her baby's heartbeat. "We're still very early along in development," Dr. Morris muttered, mostly to himself. "Everything seems fine. Heartbeat's strong." The rhythmic sound was almost hypnotic, magical, and Alice found herself smiling as she looked at the screen, riveted until she heard another sound, a frightening sound that seemed to come from within her own head, the sound of ripping paper. With a start, she looked around her for the source of the sound, but saw nothing unusual. She returned her attention to the screen, and for the moment decided to ignore it. Mark ran to the nearest window, but it wouldn't open.
Faster than a head-on collision!
Freddy roared. As Mark clawed at the window, searching for a hold, he saw movement outside. A comic book version of a semi and Dan's red truck were headed straight for one another at high speed. When they collided, the word crash appeared in jagged bubble in the air above them.
No!
Mark cried, covering his eyes with his hands. Behind him, Freddy shouted,
Deader than your darling Greta!
When Mark lowered his hands, the window was gone, replaced by a vivid drawing of Greta in an old decayed high chair, her skin rotting, her eyes gone from their sockets, her mouth hanging open and filled with mush. Mark screamed and spun around as Freddy laughed.
Able to shred stupid little boys into bits and pieces!
He lifted his deadly claw high above Mark. Everything's fine, Dr. Morris said half-heartedly, apparently preoccupied with the tennis game he was missing. He turned to Yvonne and said, I'd like to have a word with you in my office. Without waiting for a response, he left the room. Yvonne turned to Alice, shrugged, and followed him out. Alice lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering if perhaps the ultrasound would not detect any damage Freddy might cause, when the ceiling disappeared as she heard Mark screaming,
Alice!
And she saw a frightening comic book illustration of him in his room, his eyes wide with horror as Freddy brought his claws down and sliced through the drawing of Mark. They cut him as if he were paper. He was paper, and the shreds fluttered to the floor in a pool of bright red ink. No! Alice shouted, sitting up and swinging her legs off the bed, as the wall before her began to pulsate, ribbed with veins, and the vertical lips appeared once again, opening to reveal the long pink tunnel that glistened with dribbling juices, and without warning, Alice was sucked off the bed and pulled headlong into the opening. She tumbled head over heels down the twisting tunnel until she was swept into an enormous cavernous opening with viscous walls lined with pulsing veins. She lost some speed and moved slower as she tumbled between arteries and organs. She recognized them immediately. They looked like the illustrations from her biology textbooks, but she didn't understand them. Human organs hung over her like giant stars in a night sky. Alice floated slowly into a beam of glowing light and turned around to see a giant fetus, its knees curled up beneath its chin. Her eyes widened as she thought, "My baby, I'm inside myself." The fetus bobbed slightly, its umbilical cord curling from its belly, and turned toward her. Alice watched with wide-eyed fascination, smiling, until the belly of the fetus began to move, bulge, and the bulges took on human facial features. Alice gaped in horror as the features took on more definition, and she recognized Dan and Greta. Alice's scream echoed off the pink fleshy uterine walls around her as the faces yawned slightly, their eyes pleading for help, for release. She heard another scream meld with her own. It too echoed, growing closer and closer behind her. She turned to see a blob of light glowing, a soft electric blue, plummeting toward her. And she ducked, looking up to see Mark's face in the light, his mouth gaping as he shot toward the fetus, hitting its belly and disappearing in a burst of light. "No," Alice thought. "He got Mark! That bastard got Mark!" The uterine wall behind the fetus began to bulge and undulate. Facial features began to protrude from the glistening pink surface until Freddy was grinning at her, laughing.
Like father, like son.
"No!" Alice screamed. "You're not my baby's father!" And Dr. Morris leaned over her, frowning, and said, "Of course I'm not." Alice blinked, sat up, and looked around at the ultrasound equipment, sputtering. My baby! What did he do to my baby?" "There's absolutely nothing wrong with your baby. Absolutely nothing," Dr. Morris said. "He's a perfectly healthy child. A little big for so early on, but as active and normal as any baby I've ever seen." Alice turned to Yvonne and hissed, "He's feeding the souls to the baby. I saw it, all of it. And he got Mark. I saw his soul." Yvonne stepped forward quickly and said, "I'm sorry, Dr. Morris. She's been having such a tough time since Dan died. I thought it might help. I'll take her home. I'm really sorry we dragged you down here." Alice sat up and clutched Yvonne's shoulders. "He's taking their souls. He's feeding them to my baby." Glancing at Dr. Morris apologetically, Yvonne said, "I'll take her home. It'll all look different after she gets some sleep." Alice stood, and Yvonne put an arm around her, leading her out. When they were gone, Dr. Morris went into his office, picked up the phone, and dialed the Jordans, waiting for an answer. "Hello? Mrs. Jordan, this is Dr. Morris. I'm terribly sorry to call on a Sunday, but, well, I think this is rather important. It's about Alice Johnson." Chapter 10. "I promise he won't get to you, Yvonne," Alice said as Yvonne parked her car in front of Alice's house. "He got to Mark, but I won't let him get to you." "If he's getting in through your baby," Yvonne said as they went up the walk to the front door, "how are you going to stop him?" "I don't know. I'm still putting the pieces together. There's a woman I've been seeing in my dreams, a nun. There's something I'm missing." She opened the front door and they went inside. "You worry about staying awake. I'll worry about Freddy." Alice led Yvonne into the living room and they froze because Mr. and Mrs. Jordan were sitting with Alice's dad, staring at her solemnly. Alice smiled and said, "Oh, hi." "Sit down, Alice," Mrs. Jordan said. "We have something to say to you." Alice hesitated, sensing that something was up. She glanced at her father. He looked serious, but averted his eyes. "I should be getting home," Yvonne whispered. "Remember what I told you," Alice said. "Stay awake." After Yvonne left, Alice seated herself and faced the Jordans. Mrs. Jordan looked at her with a tight, pinched expression and said prissily, "We'd like to ask you, dear, exactly what you intend to do with your baby." "What I intend to do, Mrs. Jordan?" Alice asked. "Well, you can't very well raise a child on what you make at that diner, can you?" Mrs. Jordan nodded and looked at her husband. He turned away. She said, "I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you for custody of the child." "What? He's my child!" "Yours and Dan's, our grandchild. We have rights here too, you know. In your present condition, Alice, you're hardly a fit mother." "Condition? What condition? I don't have a condition." "We had a call from Dr. Morris. He said you were in his office earlier today, nearly hysterical. He said you were having paranoid delusions, hallucinations." "Wait, you don't understand. You'd been through a lot, Alice," Mrs. Jordan said. "But a child's welfare is at stake." "Look," Alice said with equal firmness, "there's no way I'm going to let you take my baby." Mrs. Jordan gave her a small, cold smile. "There's no court in the country that would let you keep the child." Alice stood, shocked that this woman would say such a thing to her. She turned to her dad and asked, "What do you say, Daddy?" He turned to her slowly, frowned, and looked at Mrs. Jordan for a moment, then said very calmly, "Well, I think you'd make a hell of a better mother than this raving bitch." Relieved, Alice stifled a giggle. Mrs. Jordan turned to Alice's dad and snapped, "You have no right to talk to me like that." "But you've got a right to walk in here and talk to my daughter any way you damn well please," he snapped back, standing. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Personally, I'd rather bodily remove you, but I'll control myself and ask you to leave." Glaring at him, Mrs. Jordan stood and said, "You'll hear from our attorneys." She stalked out of the house. Mr. Jordan stood too. I'm sorry, Alice," he said, then turned to her dad. "It's just that our grandchild is all we have left of Dan." "I understand," Mr. Johnson said, slapping Jordan on the back. "Remember, I lost my son too." After Mr. Jordan followed his wife out of the house, Alice's dad turned to her and said ominously, "I swear to God, I've never wanted to drink so badly in all my life." Then he smiled slowly and took her in his arms. Although she was off duty, Yvonne was wearing her uniform as she entered the pharmaceutical room, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. Using the key she'd sneaked away from the nurse's desk, she opened the cabinet that held the hospital's narcotics and searched the shelves frantically. When she found what she wanted, a powerful sleeping pill, she grabbed the bottle, shook 2 pills into her hand, replaced it, and closed the cabinet. She left the room and, walking casually, replaced the key on its hook at the nurse's desk. Popping the pills into her mouth, she went to the drinking fountain in the corridor and drank them down, then went to a room that she knew would be empty for the rest of the day. Lying down on the bed, she braced herself for whatever might come and closed her eyes. Alice was sickened by what she saw. She sat in the Springwood Public Library watching as microfilm newspaper articles passed before her on the screen, chronicling the lives and deaths of Fred Krueger's victims. She wasn't sure exactly what she was looking for, but she was certain she'd know it when it came. And it finally did. Killer Krueger's mother dies mysteriously. Alice froze on a photograph of a nun in a white habit, the same nun she'd seen in her waking dream the evening Dan died, and the caption below read, "Sister Mary Helena, Amanda Krueger. Was it suicide?" "Found you, lady," Alice said to herself, attracting a few annoyed glares from the readers around her. She pulled in on the woman in the picture, placed both hands flat on the table before her, and began to concentrate hard, her forehead breaking out with beads of perspiration, as she stared at Amanda Krueger intensely, until the air was sucked away from around her as it had been in Mark's room, and she shot backward, passing through some invisible hole in reality, Until she was standing before the same Gothic stone building she'd seen in Springwood Park in her waking dream days, in front of the building in which Alice had watched Fred Krueger's birth. There was no one around, so Alice entered, calling, "Amanda! Amanda Krueger! Sister Mary Helena! Are you here? Hello?" She hurried down a long corridor, determined to find the woman who'd spoken to her, the woman who had frightened Freddy Krueger. The corridor seemed endless, and although she called out again and again, she got no response. She stopped in the corridor, looking all around her, spinning to see "Jacob!" she cried, surprised to see the boy standing a few yards behind her beneath a stone archway. He was not facing her, and did not turn when she spoke. He was looking up at someone else, someone standing out of sight, behind the edge of the archway. Jacob!" He turned to her then, as if startled, looking almost guilty, and he staggered suddenly against the archway. "Jacob!" Alice shouted as she rushed toward him. It was suddenly no longer important that she find Amanda Krueger. Nothing seemed as important as helping that pale little boy. He fell into her arms when she reached him, looking into her eyes wearily. "Jacob, are you all right?" He was sweating, feverish, and he no longer looked simply pale and ill. His face was definitely different. Jacob's nose was thinner, longer. His mouth seemed smaller. His lips seemed to have taken on a half-hearted sneer. His face had taken a very familiar, frighteningly familiar characteristics. Jacob was beginning to resemble Freddy Krueger. He smiled pathetically, and with a dreamy look in his eyes began to sing, "1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, better lock the door. 5, 6. Alice gasped, listening as Jacob sang on and on, his drunken smile never wavering. "Where did you learn that song?" she asked breathlessly. "My friend taught me." He began singing again. 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. Alice shook him. "Jacob, your friend, who, Jacob? Who is he? What does he look like, Jacob?" As the boy went on singing, another voice, a woman's voice, spoke up behind Alice. "You know what he looks like." Alice spun around to see Amanda Krueger in her white nun's habit. "And you know what he wants," Amanda went on. "He wants to make your child his own." Alice nodded, as if she'd known all along. Deep down inside, she was sure she had. "How do I stop him?" she asked. "It may be too late." "What do you mean?" "Your friend Yvonne thinks she can fight your battles for you." Alice stared at her a moment in mute horror. Then, "She's fallen asleep?" Amanda nodded, looking sad, resigned. Alice turned to Jacob, but he was gone. When she called his name, Amanda whispered, "He's losing the battle." Looking at the empty space where Jacob had been only moments ago, Alice whispered, "Jacob?" thinking, "My son?" "It takes a mother's love," Amanda said. Alice screamed, "How do I stop your son?" "There isn't much time. Look how ill the child is already." She pointed down the corridor behind Alice, who spun around and gasped as Jacob staggered around a corner and disappeared. Alice tore after him, racing around the corner and down the intersecting corridor, as Jacob rounded still another corner, and another, and another, until Alice rounded a corner, and instead of Jacob, she saw Amanda ahead of her, walking toward another corridor. "Wait!" Alice called. "You have to help me!" "I can't help you here," Amanda's voice echoed back coldly. Alice doubled her fist and screamed, "I'm not going to let him win! I'll stop him with or without you!" Amanda disappeared. As Alice stood in the deserted corridor, determination burning in her eyes, she saw the wall ahead of her begin to pulse, change color, throb with veins, grow long vertical lips that opened into glistening pink tunnels. Alice took a deep breath and ran for the opening, picking up speed as she neared the wall and finally plunged between the lips, landing firmly on her feet. In Freddy's boiler room. This isn't good, she thought, as she looked around gasping when she saw Freddy. But she couldn't see all of him. From the chest up he was perfectly visible. But below that there was nothing, as if he were poking his head out of thin air. Around him the air quavered like the surface of a smooth pond being disturbed.
Welcome to Freddyland,
he quipped. What are you doing, Krueger? What are you doing to my son, to my friends? Where's Yvonne? Freddy's arm appeared suddenly, from nowhere, and his fist was closed tight on a clump of Yvonne's hair, lifting her head from the pool of thin air. Her face and hair were wet, and she shook her head, gasping, as if she'd been held underwater. Then he shoved her back into nothingness.
What's the matter, Alice?
Freddy growled.
Running out of friends again?
She tried to control herself, tried not to become emotional. Instead, she held on to her anger and said, "It's not that easy anymore, Krueger." Her forehead creased as she concentrated on Krueger and on her anger, until the invisible vertical pull became a wall of flames that engulfed Freddy. He recoiled with a gut-wrenching scream, and Yvonne tumbled from the nothingness, falling to the floor in a steaming, seared heap. "I came looking for you this time, Krueger," Alice snapped, kneeling beside Yvonne and shaking her. When Yvonne's eyes opened, Alice hissed, "Wake up!" Yvonne was gone in an instant. "This is between you and me," Alice said threateningly.
Why do you think I let her go?
"I know why you want me here, Freddy. I know you need my baby. You're ready for your next turn in the wheel, aren't you?" Some of the sick amusement left Freddy's face and his eyes narrowed. He was looking angrier by the moment. "You want to come back into the real world and kill again, don't you? And you need my baby so you can come back here even stronger. The final turn of the wheel." Freddy's knives were clanging angrily beside him, and he was beginning to snarl. "Well, you're not coming back through Jacob, you son of a bitch!" Freddy's face twisted into a hideous mask of hatred, and he lunged for her. Alice dove aside, kicking up a leg to trip him. Her foot caught his ankle, and Freddy plunged forward, flipping over the edge of the boiler room walkway, but not before he reached out and grabbed her leg, pulling her over with him. Alice screamed as they fell, fighting to maintain her control. "Remember," she told herself, "you are your own dream master." Alice concentrated hard on Greta, mentally clinging to a vivid image of her friend, until they hit the filthy concrete floor below, and Alice broke from a smooth roll to stand on her feet. She smiled triumphantly when she saw that Freddy was trapped in an enormous high chair made of filthy rusted metal. He cried out and raged as he fought to free his arms from the metal tray that crossed his lap. He curled his arms under the tray and heaved, grunting with exertion, the muscle cords in his neck pressing tightly against his skin until the tray began to make weak, cracking sounds, and Alice concentrated hard on Dan, drawing strength from his memory, power from his love, and she felt herself changing, transforming. She fell to her hands and knees, except they weren't hands and knees anymore. Her arms were above her head, stretched out on each side, like handlebars, and her legs curled up tighter and tighter, until they formed a perfectly round circle, a wheel, and another wheel grew from her chest, coming to rest on the concrete, and her engine revved. As Freddy tore the tray away and stood up in the high chair, lifting the tray over his head to throw at Alice, she shot toward him in a streak of gleaming chrome, crashing through the high chair and sending Freddy into the air, flailing helplessly like a rag doll. Alice spun around and faced him when he landed, her engine growling like a wild beast. Freddy crouched, bracing himself for her as Alice shot forward again. At precisely the right moment, Freddy jumped into the air, clambering onto Alice as she sped by. Feeling him clutching her handlebars and straddling her back, Alice began to concentrate again, this time on the asylum, on Freddy's 100 lunatic fathers. She headed straight for a concrete wall with a burst of speed, hitting it and crashing through the concrete easily, landing with a jerk on the floor of the asylum. She squealed to a halt, fell into a roll, and came out of it on her feet, herself once again, as Freddy stood and glanced around at his surroundings, with a look of frightened recognition on his face. Alice found the stairs that led to the door above and climbed them slowly, watching, waiting. They oozed from the shadows, some of them wearing filthy hospital gowns, others only tatters or completely naked. Freddy spun around to flee, but they surrounded him, coming in from all sides, closing in more rapidly as Alice watched from above. Some of them laughed, others growled, and some just made low gurgling sounds as they reached out, and Freddy looked up at Alice and screamed as they fell on him, pulling, ripping, hitting, clawing. She heard the crack of his bones, the tearing of his flesh. "Welcome home, Freddy," she breathed. As the voices of the maniacs rose to unbearable cacophony, Alice turned, walked up the stairs, and stepped into the corridor, closing the heavy iron door behind her. "Mommy, want to meet my new friend?" Alice turned with a gasp and saw Jacob standing in the corridor beside Freddy.
"You've learned a few tricks from me, Alice," Freddy said, "but you haven't learned them all."
He reached down and took Jacob's hand. Alice started toward him, shouting, "You won't hurt him! You need us both!"
"I've got you both!"
Alice stopped a few yards away and focused on Jacob. She held out her arms and called, "Come on, Jacob, time to go home." Freddy hunkered down and whispered in the boy's ear,
"This is your home."
"Jacob, listen to me. I'm your mother."
"But I'm your friend, and friends are more fun."
Jacob seemed torn, looking from Alice to Freddy and back again. She beckoned him with both hands and called his name again. He finally broke away from Freddy and ran toward her, arms outstretched, but his feet skittered to a halt, and Alice's voice caught in her throat when a man called out from behind Jacob.
Wait, Jacob!
The boy stopped and turned, and Alice looked over his shoulder. Dan was walking down the corridor toward Jacob, his smile warm and loving as he said,
Let's go to your mother.
Jacob hesitated as Dan reached down and took his hand.
Come on, Jacob.
Alice's heart ached as she watched Dan, wishing he could really be back, to stay, but she knew he wasn't. "Jacob, that's not Dan!" Alice cried. As she spoke, the Dan thing reached for Jacob's face with his right hand, and Alice screamed, "I love you, Jacob!" And Jacob tore away from the man and threw himself toward Alice, as razor-sharp claws sprang from the Dan thing's fingers, from Freddy's fingers, and swiped the air inches from Jacob's face, as the boy ran for his mother. And Alice stood, her arms open, crying, "Hurry, Jacob, come on! Jacob, come on!" Jacob dove for his mother and slid between her arms, slamming into her torso. And then they were engulfed in a sudden flash of soft glowing light as Jacob merged silently with his mother. Alice felt him pass into her body, and she sucked in a deep breath, opening her eyes and screaming as Freddy leaped toward her, plunging through the aura of white light and passing into her like a knife directly behind Jacob. Alice fell to the floor retching and cried at the top of her lungs, "Amanda!" After her cry finished echoing through the corridor, Alice heard a sound behind her and turned to see Amanda Krueger standing before a large door, the iron door that led to the room full of maniacs. "You were his mother," Alice said, struggling to her feet. "It's time to take him back." "He's an abomination," the nun hissed. "You've got to." Alice swayed with another pain, but this one did not stop. With her hands on her belly, she felt movement inside, powerful, restless movement. She looked down to see her belly growing rapidly, expanding like a balloon being inflated, and all the while there was movement within. She staggered back against the wall and cried, You're caught in a circle with him! You've got to break it! You've got to take him back!" Amanda stared at Alice's growing belly for a long moment, then stepped forward with a resignated nod. A spasm of pain knocked Alice to her knees. She looked up at Amanda pleadingly. Amanda leaned forward, placed a gentle hand on Alice's stomach, and said in little more than a breath, "My son, I forgive you." Alice convulsed as something tore away inside her, and a burst of dull light, the color of sickness and death, oozed from her abdomen, flashed, and shot directly into Amanda's, making Amanda stumble backward. Alice stood slowly, and there was a long, silent pause between them, until Amanda fell to her knees and clutched her face as her skin began to shift, to bubble like melted wax, and the skin on her hands began to shrivel and darken. Alice rushed toward her to help, but Amanda cried, "No! Get away from me! Take your son and leave! Save your son!" She paused, grimacing as Amanda's condition became worse. Her nose narrowed and lengthened. Her eyes became sinister, glistening slits. Amanda began to resemble her own monstrous son. Alice turned and dashed down the corridor, stopping a few hundred yards away when she heard a hellish scream from behind her. She turned to look at Amanda, but doors were slamming all the way down the corridor, closing the passage off and separating her from the nun. She turned again and ran on down the corridor. "No!" She looked down at her stomach. "We're going home, Jacob." Chapter 11. Months later, as Alice lay in her hospital room holding her baby, her dad and Yvonne stood beside her bed beaming. "He's beautiful," Yvonne whispered. Alice said, "Just like his dad." Smiling up at her father, she added, "And his grandpa." Her dad stroked her cheek and said, "You done good, sweetheart. I'm proud of you. And of little Jacob Daniel here. He's going to be a fine boy, a fine young man. You just wait. We'll see to that." Alice's smile faltered as she felt a lump in her throat as she whispered, "I just wish everyone could be here, Dan, Greta, Mark." She shook her head slowly. "Thank God he's gone." "Who?" her dad asked. "You know who, Dad. We've talked about him before. Freddy." Alice watched as her dad and Yvonne exchanged a troubled glance. "I know," he said, leaning close. "You've told me about him, and I believe you, but he's gone now. Like you said." "So are my friends." "I know, honey, and that's bad, but Freddy's gone. So from now on, let's think of their deaths as accidents. Dan drove into a truck, Greta choked on a piece of fish, Mark's bed collapsed and crushed him at his drawing table. I think maybe it'll make it easier to live with, okay?" She nodded hesitantly, knowing he was right. "So smile for me," he said. Alice smiled as Jacob Daniel Johnson cooed in her loving arms. Okay, Slash-a-Holics, this has been book number 60 on the channel, A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child by Joseph Locke. Gotta say, this being like the worst Freddy movie in my opinion, like my least favorite, other than the remake, I gotta say, the book differences really made the story better, in my opinion, and I really enjoyed it. Maybe I enjoyed it just because it was so different in places. But it's still, it's still not like my favorite of all of them, but I think that the book made it a little more fun. Although we didn't get Super Freddy, and that would have been fun. Again, thank you to patrons Christopher Burton Swanson for playing Dan, and Will Piccolo, for playing Mark. You guys did a great job. Thanks for your patronage, for supporting the channel, and for voicing these characters. And if anybody listening would like to voice characters and audiobooks on the channel, all you got to do is sign up on Patreon at the $10 tier or higher, and you can voice a character anytime you want. But yeah, let's break down The Dream Child real quick, the novelization. A lot of it, well, maybe not a lot, like half of this book was in line with the movie. But what got me were the differences, the different death scenes, the different nightmare scenes, like the pool one, was a lot more interesting in my opinion. The whole thing with Yvonne, it was a lot better than her just like diving in and going through the puddle and all that. It was really cool to see like the diving board changing and stuff. Having the dream with Dan with the truck, like getting picked up by claws and thrown into the boiler. That stuff was pretty damn cool. I gotta admit, the Mark death was a little... They kind of dumbed that one down a little bit. It wasn't as cool as the Super Freddy thing and getting shredded into pieces of paper, but this was a shortened version of the novelization. It's only like 80 pages, so I understand that they had to like trim some stuff down from the story, but I think they did a good job keeping most of it intact, especially that ending. That ending was so different from the movie, but in a good way, in my opinion. I really enjoyed the fact that we got more of the Dream Master powers stuff going on in that final fight with Freddy. The whole thing, trapping Freddy in the high chair, and Alice turning into a goddamn motorcycle, and tearing into him. Putting Freddy in the middle of the 100 Maniacs, his fathers, and them tearing him apart. I mean, I know he popped out of that like right away. That would have been a cool way to end the book, in my opinion. Him getting ripped to pieces, instead of the whole thing of the souls inside of him ripping him apart like in the movies. But yeah, I kind of pictured Jacob, the boy, differently in the book than I did in the movie, than what he looks like in the movie. And I just thought the book, even though it was a condensed version, because part 4 and 5 were in the same novelization, the same book, I just feel like it did a good job of carrying the story, keeping all the important stuff in there, and the differences we got really shows me what this movie could have been like if they had a bigger budget. I really think the Greta death played out a lot better in the book. It was more interesting. Micro version of herself was actually stuck in her throat. That was creepy. The whole thing with Yvonne's nightmare at the pool, I thought was a lot better. And the ending, was the way that final fight went down was a lot more intense. So I got to hand it to the author. He did a great job on this. I would love to see the original script for the Dream Child, to actually see the fleshed out version of this story, because he wrote this novelization based on the original script. And this kind of shows us the kind of stuff that had to be cut and taken out for probably budget reasons. The ending is not as conclusive for me, with just the doors slamming and Freddy screaming, as it was in the... the book isn't, the ending in the book isn't as much as like the conclusive ending from the movie. But it was still pretty cool to see Amanda Krueger playing that part of absorbing Freddy back in. But yeah, let me know what you guys thought of the novelization for the Dream Child. I gotta say, as much as I disliked the movie, I really did enjoy the book, and I'm keen to hear what you all thought of the differences from the movie. Is there any differences in the book that I didn't catch or talk about in this discussion, or the discussions I did on the individual chapter uploads? Please let me know your thoughts, what you liked, what you didn't like. And I'll be back very soon with more slasher mayhem here in the 80 Slasher Library. Going to be doing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre novelization of the remake next. Until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80 Slasher Librarian saying, thanks for listening, be excellent to each other,
Pleasant dreams!
and see you next time.
Late at night I hear a scream, pages turning in my dreams. Watch narrates a killing spree, horror tales set my soul free. In the darkness I reside, face laugh a twisted guide. Jason's mask, no place to hide. In my mind they come alive. I'm a Slash-a-Holic, can't you see? Living nightmares set me free. Michael's knife and Chucky's grin. Josh's voice pulls me back in. Final destination's near. Every death's a newfound fear. All to madness, hear my ear. Josh's words I always hear. Bloody pages, crimson sea. Monsters crawl from Final destination's near. Every death's a newfound fear. Pulled to madness year by year. Josh's words I always hear. Bloody pages, crimson sea. Monsters crawling from my screen. Josh describes it all obscene. Lost in horrors, dark and mean. Bloody pages, crimson sea. Monsters crawling from my screen. Josh describes it all obscene. Lost in horrors, dark and mean. Slash-a-Holic, can't you see? Living nightmares set me free. Michael's knife and Chucky's grin. Josh's voice pulls me back in. Final destination's near. Every death's a newfound fear. Pulled to madness year by year.